whispers, and vanishing jewels. It began quietly, as most royal crises do, not with scandalous headlines, but with murmurs from the lower vaults of Windsor. The spring inventory of jewels, an annual ritual as meticulous as scripture, was delayed. One curator mentioned discrepancies, another spoke of temporary loans. The language was careful, the tone hushed. But the unease spread quickly through the staff corridors, and by the time a senior aide brought the matter to William's attention, the whispers had taken on a dangerous coherence. Certain pieces of the royal collection, including heirlooms tied to the late Queen and to Diana herself, were missing. The official logbooks said they were out for restoration, yet no restoration orders could be found. Charles's attention was elsewhere: state visits, briefings, public appearances that demanded steady optics. And so it was William who noticed the pattern first. He requested cross-checks of the vault ledgers and quietly commissioned an independent investigator, Sir Malcolm Harcourt, a discreet former inspector whose loyalty lay with the crown rather than its courtiers. At first, the anomalies seemed small: a sapphire brooch lent to a charity exhibition that had never returned, a set of pearl earrings supposedly on loan to a museum in Edinburgh that denied any record of them. But then came something far more alarming: a necklace that had belonged to Queen Mary, last photographed decades ago, now traced to a private vault in Geneva. The Swiss intermediary had no reason to lie. He even provided photographs. The necklace's provenance matched royal archives precisely. It had been sold under the pseudonym of a private estate. Behind that sale, the investigator found a name: Charles Everley, a former aide dismissed quietly years earlier for administrative irregularities. Everley had resurfaced in London, consulting for an auction house with clients in Dubai and Geneva. The timing of his travel logs overlapped perfectly with Camilla's private trips, labeled as charity liaison. Harcourt's report landed on William's desk, bound in dark leather, its tone restrained but unmistakable. Multiple royal heirlooms had been liquidated under private authorization. The realization hit like a cold wave. These were not trinkets, they were symbols of continuity, artifacts that bridged monarchs and generations. Their loss was not measured in carats but in heritage. For William, who had spent years defending the crown's moral integrity, it was a violation far worse than theft. It was betrayal. Camilla in public was radiant as ever. Photographs of her opening a new library in Cornwall showed her smiling, warmly shaking hands, her image still that of the stable queen consort who had brought Charles solace. The BBC called her a symbol of steadiness. Reuters described her as the quiet complement to the king's intensity. None suspected what was brewing behind closed doors, but the private staff did. The whispers deepened, carried by the creak of corridors and the silence of those who had seen too much. Some said it was necessity, that Camilla needed funds for personal projects the treasury would not cover. Others suggested desperation, that she was moving assets before new oversight rules took effect. Still others whispered darker theories, that she simply wanted to erase certain relics tied too closely to Diana, replacing them with her own curated history. The Guardian ran an innocuous article about updated royal asset management, but between the lines the unease was there. Deutsche Welle reported increased scrutiny over royal transparency, while Al Jazeera referenced renewed tension within the House of Windsor, hinting at internal audits. The walls of secrecy that had long protected the monarchy were trembling, and William knew it. I remember the moment he closed the dossier. His face, calm but unreadable, reflected the burden of both son and sovereign in waiting. "We can't allow this to rot us from the inside," he said quietly. "If it's true, it ends now." That night, under the heavy hush of Windsor's halls, guards were instructed to change the access protocols to the lower vaults. No announcement, no confrontation, yet just preparation. The whispers had finally reached the point of no return. What began as missing jewelry had become a test of loyalty, integrity, and legacy. And for Camilla, whether she knew it yet or not, the vaults she once walked through with impunity were no longer hers to command. The middleman and the dossier. When Sir Malcolm Harcourt handed William the second report, it felt less like an investigation and more like a confession on paper. The first had exposed the theft. The second revealed the method. Each page was a thread in a tapestry of deception, and at its center sat a familiar name: Charles Everly. Once a mild-mannered aide who managed travel itineraries and correspondence for Camilla, he had quietly built a network that stretched from London to Geneva and Dubai. He was the invisible hand that turned heirlooms into capital. Everly had been dismissed years ago after administrative irregularities, a polite euphemism the palace used when it wished to bury scandal without inquiry. But Camilla had not fully severed contact. According to Harcourt's findings, she had employed him indirectly through heritage consultants who managed her personal charities. Emails retrieved from encrypted accounts showed requests for valuation assessments on unnamed family pieces. The dates matched the disappearance of the jewels precisely. I remember reading the correspondence in disbelief. The tone was careful, the wording precise, no incriminating phrases, just enough ambiguity to blur intent. Proceed with discretion, one line read. Ensure restoration precedes shipment, said another. To anyone else, these would sound harmless. But Harcourt's team matched serial numbers from auction houses and tracked transfers through intermediaries in Geneva. The so-called restorations were sales, the shipments were deliveries, and the jewels were gone. When William confronted Harcourt privately, the veteran investigator spoke plainly. Sir, this was not desperation, it was design. The words landed heavily. Camilla's name was not on any document, but her signature was everywhere in the language, in the timing, in the choice of intermediaries she had trusted for decades. As the dossier grew, so did the gravity of the evidence. Handwritten notes from Everly detailed transactions using royal code names, bank transfers routed through shell charities, and quiet donations made to foundations under Camilla's patronage. The money was not extravagant, it was symbolic. What mattered was not profit, but autonomy. The vaults that had belonged to the crown were for a time under her control alone. When the BBC later reported that internal accounting reforms were being introduced, few understood what it really meant. Reuters hinted at it more directly. A tightening of access protocols to royal collections following irregularities. Al Jazeera described it as a response to emerging questions of stewardship, while The Guardian quietly confirmed private internal audits ordered by the Prince of Wales. Behind those euphemisms lay Harcourt's report, a ledger of lost jewels and broken trust. The confrontation between William and Everly came next. It took place in a discreet office in London, not a palace chamber. Everly, pale and trembling, insisted he had acted under instruction, but refused to name his patron. His exact words, recorded in Harcourt's notes, still echo in my mind. Her Majesty trusted me to arrange things she could not be seen to arrange herself. William said nothing in reply, but the silence in that room carried the force of judgment. In the following days, Harcourt's dossier expanded further, linking travel itineraries, financial records, and confidential memoranda. One section detailed Camilla's overseas trips labeled heritage consultations, which according to cross-referenced customs declarations coincided with jewelry entering and leaving the country under diplomatic seal. Each instance had been signed off as royal private correspondence. The optics were devastating. What might once have been dismissed as rumor now had the weight of forensic detail. I recall how William stood by the window of Clarence's house, the dusk light catching his reflection. It's not just the jewels, he said quietly. It's what they represent. If she's willing to sell history, she's willing to sell trust. Inside the palace, staff moved with tension thick as glass. Guards at the lower vaults changed rotation schedules. Access logs were restricted to the heir and 2 archivists. Camilla continued her public duties unaware that her movements were now shadowed by quiet surveillance. The Guardian later described this period as a palace divided between ceremony and suspicion. Deutsche Welle reported a tightening silence around Windsor's inner circle. Yet the most telling moment came one evening when Camilla's personal secretary was escorted from the building carrying 2 sealed briefcases. She did not return. By then, William had everything he needed: proof of authorization, evidence of sales, and motive disguised as pragmatism. The dossier's final line, handwritten by Harcourt, read, "The jewels may be gone, but what has been taken cannot be replaced." In that sentence, I saw the full weight of the betrayal, not theft for greed, but for control. Camilla had not sold trinkets. She had sold the symbols of continuity, the tangible inheritance of those who came before. And in doing so, She had crossed the invisible line that separates survival from overreach. Confrontation. In the blue room. The moment William decided to confront her, the air in Windsor grew different. Thicker. Somehow charged with the quiet hum of something irreversible. The blue room, with its heavy drapes and portraits of monarchs past, had been chosen deliberately. It was private but symbolic, a setting that carried the weight of history. I was there, standing near the back as William entered, first dossier in hand, his expression measured but cold. Camilla followed moments later, her smile brittle. Her tone controlled, the queen consort still clinging to dignity, even as the walls began to close around her. The exchange began politely, almost absurdly so. William thanked her for meeting on short notice. She nodded, crossing her hands neatly in front of her, her eyes flicking briefly to the folder he carried. Then he opened it. He didn't raise his voice or dramatize the evidence, he simply began reading aloud. Each line from Sir Malcolm Harcourt's report landed with precision. The missing necklace traced to Geneva. The falsified restoration orders, the coded emails to Charles Everley. At first, Camilla said nothing. Her gaze shifted from the papers to the floor, her composure beginning to crack. Finally, she broke the silence. "Those pieces were not stolen," she said softly. "They were moved for restoration. Diplomatic gifts require discretion." William let the words hang before replying. "Restoration doesn't end in Geneva, and diplomacy doesn't use pseudonyms." His voice carried no anger, only an exhausted clarity. He pushed the folder across the table toward her. The pages fanned open, showing photographs of the jewels on foreign soil. The evidence was irrefutable. Camilla's response was part denial, part justification. She spoke of the burden of image, of her constant need to rebuild trust, of how certain pieces had been symbolically reassigned to strengthen international goodwill. She invoked the language of duty, of acting for the crown, not herself. But beneath the polished words, her tone wavered. "It was not conviction I heard, it was fear." For years, Camilla's endurance had been her armor. She had survived scandal, ridicule, and decades of public hostility. The BBC had once called her the unshakable constant beside the king, while Reuters praised her for transforming adversity into quiet strength. But here in this room, heavy with silence, that armor faltered. This was not the defiance of a survivor. It was the desperation of someone who realized her strategy had gone too far. William remained steady, almost surgical. "This isn't about money," he said. "It's about what those pieces mean. You didn't just sell jewels, you sold memory." He paused, his voice tightening slightly. "Some of these were my mother's." That line hit its mark. For a brief moment, her face changed. Something between regret and resentment flickered across it. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "You think I haven't carried enough shame for my place in this family? I was trying to preserve what little control I have left." Her words revealed more than she intended. It wasn't greed, it was survival. Control, not wealth, was what she sought. In the monarchy's rigid hierarchy, she had always been the outsider, tolerated, but never fully embraced. Selling the jewels was her act of defiance against that exclusion, an attempt to carve out autonomy within an institution that constantly reminded her she was not born to it. But for William, that nuance didn't matter. The act itself had broken a sacred covenant. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was resolute. "Control doesn't come from possession," he said. "It comes from trust. And you've spent that." After that, there was nothing left to say. Camilla sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the dossier. When she finally stood, her expression was unreadable, neither guilt nor anger, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had ended. That evening, palace staff were instructed to tighten vault protocols once more. Keys were reassigned, safes recoded, and new custodians appointed. Camilla's access was suspended indefinitely for administrative review. The Guardian called it a procedural realignment. Deutsche Welle noted unusual restrictions on royal consort prerogatives, and Al Jazeera, less diplomatic, declared, "The Queen Consort's trust is gone." In truth, the confrontation in the Blue Room marked more than a scandal, it was the fracture of illusion. For years, Camilla's composure had hidden the quiet machinery of control that kept her afloat. But now, with every word of that dossier, the machinery lay exposed. She had tried to preserve her place by managing legacy, Instead, she had dismantled it. When she left the room, her footsteps echoed against the marble floor. William remained behind, motionless, his hand resting on the folder. For the sake of the crown, he said quietly, to no one in particular, it ends here. And in that moment, the monarchy's future tilted away from secrecy, away from survival at any cost, and back toward the truth that Camilla had spent her life trying to contain. Shockwaves, spin, and backlash. The confrontation in the Blue Room rippled through the palace like a silent detonation. There was no official statement, no leaks to the press, at least, not at first. But in an institution built on hierarchy and whispers, nothing stays hidden for long. Within a week, rumors began to seep into the corridors of power. Courtiers spoke in coded phrases, restricted access, internal audit adjusted prerogatives. Every euphemism masked the same truth: the queen consort had lost her grip on the crown's most sacred trust. Behind closed doors, the communications team scrambled. Spin was their first defense, and Camilla's advisors had perfected it over decades. They coordinated with familiar allies at the Telegraph and the Daily Mail, planting soft focus stories about her overwhelming schedule, her quiet devotion to literacy, and her personal sacrifices for the king. The BBC ran a short piece about streamlining of royal procedures, while Reuters cautiously reported internal reviews of artifact stewardship. It was damage control disguised as modernization, but the cracks were too deep for narrative repair. The Guardian, always more probing, published an analysis titled Palace Power Dynamics in Flux. Without naming names, it described a tightening of authority around the Prince of Wales and a recalibration of ceremonial influence. Deutsche Welle was more direct: Camilla's administrative privileges have been curtailed following questions about royal heritage management. The story was out. For William, there was no satisfaction in being right. The revelations had struck at the family's core. He understood the palace machinery well enough to know what would follow: rehearsed smiles at public events, endless speculation about motives, and a desperate push to keep the monarchy appearing united. Catherine, ever composed, became his quiet ally in this storm. Together, they doubled down on transparency, attending events that emphasized charity and service rather than ceremony. Their warmth stood in stark contrast to the frost gathering around Camilla. Camilla herself moved through those weeks like a ghost. Her public face remained serene, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She continued her engagements, visiting schools, attending charity galas, but her once confident stride had softened. Reporters who had long supported her now hesitated. Even the Telegraph, her most sympathetic outlet, noted a new distance between the queen consort and the next generation of royals. The backlash online was immediate and merciless. Hashtags invoking Diana trended across social media platforms as users contrasted her legacy of authenticity with Camilla's scandal. Al Jazeera summarized it bluntly: the British public, already divided over monarchy, now questions the moral stewardship of its symbols. Polling from YouGov confirmed the trend. Camilla's favorability fell sharply among younger Britons, while William and Catherine's approval soared. Inside the palace, the response was swift and surgical. Access protocols to the royal vaults were overhauled. Only 3 signatures, Charles, William, and the Lord Chamberlain, could now authorize movement of any royal artifact. Camilla's household was quietly restructured. Several long-serving aides were reassigned or retired by mutual agreement. A new audit department was created, reporting directly to the king. It was, as one staff member murmured to Reuters, a soft exile disguised as reform. The optics were carefully managed. The palace released photographs of Charles and Camilla attending Sunday service at Crathie Kirk, their smiles dutifully warm. But the distance between them was visible even through the lens. The BBC noted the unusual formality in their demeanor, and The Guardian remarked that the couple's synchronized gestures of affection appeared rehearsed rather than instinctive. Behind the walls, though, the fracture widened. William's team began drafting contingency plans for a public clarification, something short of scandal, but strong enough to reassert the crown's integrity. The idea was to reset the narrative, emphasizing modernization and accountability. Camilla's advisors resisted fiercely, fearing it would cement her culpability. But the tide was against them. Even Charles, torn between loyalty and duty, began to understand the cost of silence. Reuters later reported that he privately conceded that difficult adjustments were necessary to protect the institution. For the monarchy, this was a survival moment, the same kind Camilla had once mastered. Only this time, she was on the wrong side of the equation. By late spring, the story had fully escaped containment. The Guardian ran a front-page piece titled "Jules Trust and the Future of the Crown." Deutsche Welle aired a documentary segment on royal accountability. International coverage framed it as both scandal and transformation. Al Jazeera called it the monarchy's reckoning with its own contradictions. Through it all, Camilla endured as she always had, silently, elegantly determined to outlast. But even endurance has limits. The palace had shifted around her, and though she still bore the title of Queen Consort, the influence that title once carried was gone. She remained in photographs and ceremonies in the language of tradition, but not in the trust of those who mattered most. The Blue Room confrontation had become a whisper of legend among palace staff, a turning point spoken of in low voices. And in its aftermath, the monarchy stood transformed, cleaner perhaps, but colder. The old guard of quiet secrecy had been replaced by William's unflinching insistence on transparency. The crown had survived, but something human in it, something fragile and fallible, had been lost in the process. Decree reckoning what remains. When the announcement came, it was brief, formal, and devastatingly clear. By the direction of His Majesty, and with the consent of the Council, the title and ceremonial privileges of the Queen Consort are to be reassigned. Those 24 words marked the quiet end of an era and the beginning of a reckoning that no amount of diplomacy could soften. Camilla, once hailed as the unshakable partner who steadied Charles through decades of turbulence, had been stripped of her title. Officially, it was presented as a restructuring of ceremonial duties. Unofficially, everyone knew it was a punishment, the monarchy's way of closing ranks to protect itself. The decree was read aloud at Buckingham Palace before a select group of staff journalists and courtiers. William stood at his father's side, his expression solemn but resolute. The Guardian described him as the face of reform, while Deutsche Welle called the move a generational assertion of moral stewardship. Charles, by contrast, looked gaunt, his face the color of parchment. To him, this was not just an institutional correction. It was the unraveling of the woman who had defined his private life for nearly half a century. Camilla did not attend. At the exact hour the statement was released, she was seen leaving Clarence House in a black car, her head bowed, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses. The BBC later reported she was bound for Ray Mill, her private estate in Wiltshire, to consider her position. That phrasing, so quintessentially British, concealed the truth: she had been exiled not by law, but by legacy. International reaction was swift and unforgiving. Reuters called it the most significant internal reordering of royal power since the abdication crisis. Al Jazeera framed it as the crown's choice of symbolism over sentiment, while the New York Times wrote, "The monarchy has chosen to preserve itself by amputating the limb that once steadied it." The decision shocked royal observers, but within Britain, it was met with a surprising calm. Polls released by YouGov days later showed overwhelming approval for William's handling of the affair, particularly among younger generations. Trust in the monarchy had rebounded. Trust in Camilla had collapsed. Charles withdrew from public appearances for several days, citing fatigue. Behind the scenes, insiders described a man torn between grief and duty. The BBC aired footage of him attending Sunday service alone, his hand briefly trembling as he accepted condolences from parishioners. For all his public restraint, the toll was unmistakable. Camilla had not just been his wife. She had been his companion through humiliation and reform. Yet the same survival instincts that once united them had now destroyed her. In the weeks that followed, Camilla's name was gradually removed from official communications. She retained the style Her Royal Highness, but was no longer referred to as Queen Consort in state documentation. Her patronages were quietly redistributed among Catherine, Anne, and Sophie. The jewels, what remained of them, were returned to Windsor under new protocols, requiring triple verification for any future transfer. The vaults once her domain were now off limits entirely. For William, the act was not vengeance but preservation. In an interview weeks later, when asked indirectly about the reforms, he replied, The monarchy must be worthy of its history. It was a statement heavy with subtext: the crown must survive not through inheritance alone, but through integrity. Catherine, by his side, added softly, "Symbols mean nothing without trust." Camilla's reckoning, however, was not absolute defeat. Even in retreat, she retained that peculiar strength that had always defined her endurance. She retreated to Ray Mills, surrounded by loyal aides, and resumed correspondence with charities. A BBC correspondent described her as graceful in exile. There were no interviews, no public statements, only the occasional photograph: a woman walking her dogs across the Wiltshire fields, coat buttoned tight, the wind tugging at her hair. In her silence, she preserved a measure of dignity, if not redemption. The monarchy, for its part, emerged more disciplined, but colder. Its survival had come at the cost of sentiment. Anne continued her unbroken service. Catherine flourished as the monarchy's modern face, and William assumed a steadiness reminiscent of his grandmother. Yet beneath the surface, one could feel the echo of that Blue Room confrontation, the moment when truth shattered decorum, when the family's private loyalties surrendered to public duty. As I reflect on it now, I see the story of Camilla not as villainy, but as inevitability. She had spent her life fighting to be seen, to be accepted, to control her narrative in a world that constantly defined her through someone else's tragedy. But control, once it becomes obsession, breeds isolation. In the end, her greatest strength, her will to endure, became the very thing that undid her. The crown chose continuity over compassion, and perhaps it had to. In doing so, it reaffirmed what monarchy truly is: not a family, not a marriage, but an institution built to survive its own humanity. The jewels will be catalogued again, the vaults sealed, the ceremonies rehearsed anew. But the ghost of that vault and of the woman who tried to control it will linger in every reflection of those polished stones. And somewhere in Wiltshire, I imagine Camilla looking at the morning sun, still wearing that half smile the world mistook for serenity, whispering perhaps the only truth she ever lived by: survival is not victory, it is endurance without applause.